First of all, another round of applause, please, for our panelists and their instructive talks and takes on the politics of memory. I'm going to jump right in with the questions and ask that we just really go to... Can you hear me? I told you I wanted to jump right in to our questions and ask that we really just go to the heart of the matter so we can try to get through as many of these as possible. Bree, consciousness and activism can both be moment-by-moment things. And so I am wondering, in the moment, as you are preparing to climb the flagpole, as you are climbing the flagpole, as you are descending, what are you thinking? What are you affirming and what are you opposing? And what do those moments sort of feel like? Because those are the moments where people make decisions about where they are in terms of the politics of memory.
Yes, certainly. So in a lot of the lead up, I spoke to that during my presentation of kind of like dealing with fear and just the practical reality of the danger that I was about to face. At the time that I was actually scaling the pole, I had made peace with all of that, right? So we, before going into the action, we had looked at what the, possible consequences were in terms of like what's the, greatest amount of criminal charges we might face. We thought through the worst case scenario where I might be on the pole and a vigilante comes by with a gun, and what would we do in that situation? And really, there was nothing that we could do in that situation. So I had made peace with all of that. And so at the time that I was scaling the pole, I was really just in a moment of what I call the peace that surpasses understanding. That's what we refer to it as in the Christian faith. And that's just kind of like having the peace of the Holy Spirit with you. Because I knew that the mission that I was engaging in was a just cause. And people oftentimes ask me how I felt at the time that I was being arrested. And my honest answer, I felt free. I felt free in the same way that I've heard John Lewis speak to being free. And it's a type of freedom where you know that there is a law greater than the written law, right? That's the law that we speak to as being self-evident, a self-evident truth. And so as I was scaling, I was just trying to keep the police officers at the bottom column. I was letting them know that this is a nonviolent direct action. This is the full extent of it. I was praying to myself all the way up. And coming down, and really just staying focused on, being safe as I'm scaling.
Julian, you have talked about and written about how Indigenous memory can be a catalyst for political activism. Talk about that. Explain what you mean by that kind of Indigenous memory. We have an analog bone memory.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of the panelists today and Dr. Kende, when he, in his talk, talked about the power really of remembering things that have been purposefully forgotten, erased, effaced, marginalized. And I think that when I speak to the power of Indigenous memory, of honoring this place as Piscataway traditional territory, of speaking a language that was, that my grandmother and my grandparents were beaten for speaking in the residential schools in Canada, that there's a power in remembering the things that were not only forgotten, but were tried to be taken from you, often by force. And I think that for many Indigenous people, because there is that deep history of erasure, and there's also the simultaneous reality of invisibility in many places here in the United States, that our activism often begins with that purposeful remembering. So there are many community-based organizations. There's one that I know of in Oakland where they actually walk Oakland and remember it as Ohlone territory. They go to all these places where their ancestors were buried, where there's shell mounds, and now there's a BART station or a basketball court. And they remember it purposefully as what it was for their people. And I think that just as a beginning point for action can be quite powerful.
It's interesting, across different peoples, you're both talking about a state of mind as you go about these works and these acts of activism. Andrew, in examining European history, what are the points of connection and commonality in the construction and the destruction of memorials and monuments as a constant? in political storytelling, across continents, across seas, across time. And how do you relate that to this ongoing political moment where so much of the iconography of American history is up for grabs? So where do you see the analogs there?
I see lots of analogs, and actually, to be honest, what's going on right now in the United States and beyond, I think, has offered me a lot of fruit for discussion in the classroom when I'm talking about European history to make these connections. So I'm an historian, and so as an historian, I'm going to give the typical historian answer, which is context. So much of what we can learn in the case of these monuments together is context. Who built this thing, and when? With what agenda? With what kind of funding? And then how has this thing been used? In the case, I think, of the Karl Marx monument, or in the case of so many of these other monuments that we've been talking about, oftentimes the monument itself, it's beyond, that's why I use the term the politics of dead men's monuments, right? It's the person, and what the person, usually himself, believed or spoke for, has a relevance, I think, on a secondary level. It's who built this and how is it being used? How is this thing politicized now? And so, if Robert E. Lee said a nice thing here or there or had good intentions, that to me is irrelevant in comparison to how this monument, who built it and what it's supposed to represent. Right? The Karl Marx monument was really a boot in the face of the population of Leipzig in ways that would have been really just incomprehensible to Karl Marx himself, right? The German philosopher. And so I think that, that those are valuable questions. And then this, I think, unavoidable question too, if we seek to deal with our past, and this is something that has been going on in Germany, especially since the Second World War, seeking to deal with our past, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. But if we are to try to deal with our past, if you eliminate the monument, there is an absence. That absence has to be filled by something. If you leave a void there, something else will fill it of its own volition, right? There are going to be many forces campaigning on what's to fill that. And so that has got to be a broad discussion, and the power of that site is you reinscribe it or seek to draw out older inscriptions. That has to be very carefully discussed. And then what you do with this thing, right? You need to think about the monument as almost this radioactive substance, right? And there is a toxicness to it that is not necessarily destroyed if the physical monument itself is destroyed, right? Sometimes obliteration is necessary, right? Recently in Germany, the grave of Rudolf Hess, who was one of Hitler's closest associates, was destroyed because it had become a site for the gathering of neo-Nazis, right? It was very contested. It was very much broadly discussed. But the grave was obliterated, and his remains were scattered in the ocean, and that was the end of it, right? And so there's this discussion, what do we do with it? Sometimes obliteration is necessary. Other times you're actually just making things worse, and you're losing a moment where you can, I think, disempower, deconstruct, and contextualize. And so this is a very difficult conversation, but one that I think can be very valuable.
And I want to talk about that in terms of the granularity of these monuments and mascots and icons. I live off of Lee Highway. I moved from Prince George's County to Centerville, Virginia. It's a long story. And my daily commute has me going on Lee Highway, which was constructed as this sort of intercontinent, or just, within, from sea to sea kind of a highway that daily reminds me of Lee. In a way, you were talking about Karl Marx, that Lee himself did not want, right? He was not a proponent of Confederate iconography after he lost the Civil War. So my question is, in encountering these mascots and these spaces, what are the granular conversations you have with people about this contested memory and about money? There are people who will say we can't rename the Washington football team because of the monetary considerations, or changing Lee Highway or a school costs too much. What do you say to them, and how do you engage these conversations at that very eye level? And anyone can take it.
I can jump in there. I think it's important to understand that it's not simply about memory and how we remember things, right? But it's really about the purpose that they serve within their current political context. So, you know, like for instance, with the Confederate monuments, most of the Confederate monuments that exist here, they were built in the early 20th century at the rise of Jim Crow. And it wasn't simply about how are we remembering the Civil War, but it was about making it clear to everyone that yes, the South may have lost the war, but the ideology of white supremacy is still here. The white power structure that was in place before the Civil War is still in place. And so when you see the monument outside of the courthouse, that's a reminder to you that the courthouse is still the white power structure. And regardless of, you know, maybe what the federal government says, that's how we do things down here, right? That's what raising the Confederate flag over the State House in 1961, that's what it meant. It was like, y'all may be doing all these sit-ins at the counter, but we still run things down here. And so it's important that we are not only examining the history, right? We're not only talking about the history of the Confederacy and of slavery, but we're talking about white supremacy today, because that's why the monument is a point of contention. That's why the Columbus statue in Columbus Circle is a point of contention, is because these issues are not ended. The white supremacy is still going, and the monuments are a monument to that ideology that is very much alive in our policies and social practices.
Julian, do you, in terms of that kind of granularity, what are we looking at?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Bree has said. I just would add on, I think it's almost like you have to do two things at once. On the one hand, I think you need to be speaking truth to power, which can take great courage, as I think Bree's story points out. You know, there's a need to say it plainly what these monuments represent and what they are doing today in our society, who they're empowering, whose stories they're telling, and what that means for the people who are on the other side of those histories. At the same time, I think there's also a great need to meet people where you're at, where they're at, you know? I mean, I think writing about Indigenous folks often presents its own set of challenges. There's very little working knowledge that you have when in my role I try to relate the issues that Native people face today and its relationship to history. And I think that's a tall order. I think that you know, it takes a long time to learn, as we all know. You know, it takes a long time to learn. It takes a long time to unlearn. And I think that on the one hand, we need the Brees of the world to be out there, you know, taking on, assailing the fortress at the same time as we need to be re-educating the folks who are inside that fortress and who as Dr. Kende's talk alluded to earlier, whose self-interest has been caught up in these very backwards and damaging beliefs and ideas.
I want to do one more question to anyone in the group and then open it up for questions from the audience, which is, given that, as Dr. Kende points out, that self-interest is the root of racist policies and that there is a great deal of money in these mascots and monuments, what should be the goal for activists and thinkers and scholars? Is it a recontextualization? Is it a wholesale tearing down, right? All of these are muscular verbs, right? Whatever we have to do, we have to put some cultural muscle in it to make the politics follow. And so what is the end game? What would be the best place to engage these and decide on what we want from these contested symbols?
Well, I would underpin a discussion we were having with Professor Kende and that Julian just brought in, that education is such an important place to do this. You know, if we think about countries like Germany and Poland, which after World War II had, we might say, you know, the worst relations of any two countries in the world, potentially, there was a textbook commission that was founded in the 1960s between West Germans and Poles to try, despite competing victim narratives, competing narratives of perpetration, really this black and white history, to find what do we have in common and can we find a narrative through which we can underpin our common humanity. And that argument in Kende's research about finding our common humanity, that it is something beyond the politics that have created these monuments, I think is a valuable thing to keep in touch.
But that education for folks who don't know what they don't know and don't care to, and that as that ignorance is a deliberate act, when do you just go in and take the flag down or put up Black Lives Matter over it or spray paint or, you know?
Well, I mean, that's part of what's happening, right? I mean, that's what people are doing. You have some cases like a Charlottesville where the community was able to successfully lobby their city council to remove it. And then you have places where the city and state refuse. And that's why we resort to protest as a way to push for the change. I think that in some cases, yes, the things have to come down because the way that they are constructed, and I think it was wonderful the way he was speaking to, you know, using Columbus as an example. The way that many of these monuments are constructed, it is to commemorate, it is to valorize, it is to celebrate the cause of slavery and racism. And again, it's important, like when we're talking about education, like we don't simply want to take it down and then never talk about it again, because that's dangerous. You know, you could, following the Holocaust, they could have said, okay, we're gonna get rid of Nazi memorabilia and never talk about it again. That's dangerous because that's how it happens again. And part of the reason that it keeps happening here is because we have not dealt with it yet. We have not ever had that moment of reconciliation and truth and justice. And that's why when you look at today, here we are, 2018, 50 years since really like the end of the civil rights movement, and we're still in the same position. The Kerner Commission, which was done in 1968, the same results we see today. The black poverty rate for children is the same as it was in 1968. That's not a result of simply the monuments being there, right? So simply taking the monuments away doesn't solve that. And so we have to recognize that it's not simply about how we remember the past, it's how we understand the present and how we bring these two things into reconciliation with each other.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think I agree with what both Andrew and Bree have said. I think that there's two things that come to mind for me. The first is that there's an opportunity with these monuments to point out hypocrisy, right? Like, there is an alternative set of potentially values and also sometimes myths that the United States and all these societies like to tell themselves about democracy, fairness, equality, and those can be a useful tool in pointing out the hypocrisy of monuments that are, you know, memorializing everything but that. On the other hand, I think from the perspective of people who want to change these monuments and everything that they enable and empower in society, you know, having employed kind of two different tactics in that, in one place I was behind a group that was like, we gotta tear all this stuff down, basically. In another place, I was in a group that was trying to build a small plaque. I have to say that when you put some heat behind your arguments, you know, when you put the argument that like, hey, like you guys got to take this down, people really pay attention in a way that they don't when you come to them like, hey, we'd really like it if you like built a plaque that said that, you know, your university is named for a conqueror and is on the land of people who were massacred and their lands were all stolen. Like, you know, that'd be really nice. When you do it the first way, people like take attention, you know, people start to be like, whoa, maybe we really do need to change. Maybe this really could be something that we need to take into account. So I think that's one point that I think is important to put out there, that these, you know, we get accused of being Taliban and Maoists and all these sort of, you know, people who want to tear apart history, but there's also a strategic element to putting heat behind your demands.
And can I just add real quick, and that's the thing too, like it's not about tearing apart history. Confederate monuments themselves represent an erasure of history. They themselves are an erasure of history. And so, you know, like if we were to take down a monument, I don't think it's necessary to leave it nothing there. Let's take down Columbus, let's erect a statue that valorizes the people who used to be there. And then we can put a plaque that talks about how there used to be a Columbus statue there.
And that's why context is so crucial too. I mean, you know, the Nazis, one of the first things the Nazis did when they invaded Poland was demolish all the monuments to Polish poets and thinkers and such, right? So we're not just talking about demolishing monuments to demolish monuments, and that I think is, or else we'll be accused of being ISIS and everything else, right? It's this issue of context. Who built it? What was the objective? And what kind of world are we trying to build and put in this space? And I'll add, too, that the debate about what to build on the site where the Karl Marx was not a picnic. I mean, you had a university president president resign in protest because he didn't want anything on the site that recalled the vanished church. Sure, get rid of Karl Marx, but I don't want anything here because that's bad publicity for my university. I mean, he didn't put it that way, but that's what he meant, right? And so that debate, that question of erasure, that question of blank spaces where there's nothing to commemorate, but then, what are you commemorating? And certainly in that depiction, has to be give and take.
And just to add one thing, I mean, isn't that such an exciting conversation to have, right? Like when we start talking about taking these monuments down, it begs the question of what goes in their place. And to me, that can be such an exciting and empowering conversation. What is the alternative?
And
what
so
is the other way
open,
we
such
talk
a
about
chance
these things?
to create, right? Such a chance to get a fact base, to get a different narrative going and to take root. So my takeaway points from the three of you all are muscle, heat, education. Those are all, we think that's a winning combination. Yeah. I want to open the floor up for questions for our panelists on the politics of memory. There's microphones set up. Please, go ahead.
Howdy. This question is for Bree. I had never heard any mention of James in any of the coverage of the protest. And not only was he there, you mentioned that it was strategic and intentional. Can you speak more about that debate, that process of getting to involving him?
Yeah, certainly. So the folks who came together, it was about 9 of us, and half of us did not know the other half. Half of us were Black, Black Lives Matter protesters, activists, and the other half were white who had been involved in Occupy Charlotte and environmental justice protests. And we were brought together by a mutual friend, and I think it says something about him that we were all willing to trust each other, not knowing each other. And so I didn't meet James until that meeting. And as I said, the first practical consideration was simply how are we going to get the flag down? That's how it ended up being the method of scaling the pole because of the fence that they had built around it.
Had you trained for anything like that?
I did, yes. A Greenpeace activist trained me over the course of a day and a half on how to scale the pole. And yeah, it was pretty radical. Yeah. So, so when we made that first decision, it was clear it was going to be me. That's when we kind of thought through, okay, what do we want to communicate visually? We wanted to represent that the group was interracial. We wanted to represent, that the group had multi-gender representation. And visually, it represented the dismantling of systemic racism. Here I am climbing up, kind of representing this prolonged struggle to dismantle this thing. And here's James at the bottom as the white ally standing in solidarity with me. That's how it ends. That's how racism ends, just in a visual representation of it.
Yes, sir.
My question is kind of towards Bree, but anyone can answer it because she kind of identified herself as a Christian, but it's really not a Christian question. Just to kind of give you context, I grew up thinking Egyptians were white, watching TV, looking at the movies and this, that, and the other. Till my eyes were kind of open. And you talk about white supremacy, it kind of is what it is, but what I'm saying is, within our community, in the Black church, what can we do to get rid of this white Jesus? Because when you look at people migrations, when you look at the physical description in the book, it is clear that he is not a European, he's a Black male. And his imaging is very, very important, particularly with the monuments and with white supremacy, this, that, the other. So the first thing you always hear is that, well, his color doesn't matter. Well, if his color doesn't matter, then why don't you just tell the truth? So that would be kind of my question.
Ooh, I could give a whole sermon on that. But just quickly, yes, the image of white Jesus is a very important part of white supremacy, of colonialism. When missions would go to, other nations and they would colonize it, they would also bring this idea of a white savior and the idea of God being a white man, conceptualizing God as literally a white man. And that was in order to reinforce the social order, right? As above, so below. White man rules up here, white man rules on earth. And so within the context of the Christian faith, no, skin color doesn't matter. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of why racism and white supremacy separates you from God, because we are all brothers and sisters, we are all children of God, and your skin color doesn't place any kind of value on your life. But within the context of dismantling white supremacy, it absolutely matters that we continue, every time a new film comes out about Jesus, he's depicted as a white man. Not only is he depicted as a white man, but he is more clearly Anglo than all the other Jews who surround him, right? It matters that Egyptians are consistently portrayed as being white. That is part of the idea of white supremacy, because we are supposed to believe that Europe brought civilization to the world, that civilization didn't exist outside of Europe landing in different continents and saving us all from our savagery and our, being uncivilized. And that's part of also why African history itself has to be suppressed. Not just the history of ancient Egypt, the history of Songhai, the history of Mali and Ghana, and all of it has to be suppressed in order to maintain this ideology.
I'm reminded of Andrew's talk and of Julian's, the constant suppression of history and the interpreting for the purposes of, self-interest in the moment. So I love the way all these connections, like all of these conversations speaking to each other. Go ahead, please.
Hi. My comments are going to be both a question and comments.
Okay, quickly, please.
I commend you all on taking this first step towards addressing the power of images. My name is Peggy Seats. I'm the founder and CEO of the Washington Interdependence Council. For the past 22 years, I have endured a lot of torture and malignment in trying to upgrade Benjamin Banneker Overlook Park to a world-class memorial. It is the first national memorial dedicated to an African American in the history of the nation's capital. My first two board members were women. Dr. Dorothy Height and Mrs. Louise Hutchison, who in 1968 or late 1960s got the city to name Banneker Overlook Park for him after they had decided they would name the half-mile corridor of LaFont Plaza to LaFont. And I commend you all on this first step, and I said first step because it seems to be basically focusing on memorials to white men. And I even look in the program, and there are, about 16 men that were invited to speak, and only 2 women. So we have to not only deal with the injustices of racism, but also sexism. And with the first memorial to an African American, which is much needed, especially now, Benjamin Banneker, and due to him, he was, as we have decided to refer to him as, is a man of many firsts. He was the first in many areas of redress, not just 1 or 2. But also the fact that women still don't get any props or recognition. Even though I've sacrificed 22 years of my life, all my wealth, and even my health, because the developers had their security guards beat me up and cause permanent damage to me to try to get me to discontinue my effort for the Banneker Memorial. I'm sorry, you don't want me to finish?
No, I do. I just want to get a question to the panel, because you raised something that's so interesting about the sexism and the politics of memory as it pertains to gender.
Are they the only ones that are allowed to talk on this thing? If not, I can go sit back down. I'm trying to give you information so that I can ask the emphatic question, which you all already get. What about sexism? Yes. But I also want to make a comment that I'm insulted to not be even invited to this panel when I have 22 years invested in trying to upgrade a memorial to a black man, Benjamin Banneker, and also the first memorial, Benjamin Banneker Memorial, in the nation's capital to a black man was done by a black woman, Mrs. Louise Hutchinson, and the first one in the outer core of the interior of DC was erected by Dr. Dorothy Height. So I think that you all need to get with the program and talk about sexism in commemoration as well as racism.
Thank you so much for that valuable history. And let's engage that. What about sexism in the politics of memory?
Yeah, no, I think that that's such an essential point. I mean, one thing that I left out of my talk, which was my own mistake, was that many of the white men who are memorialized here were also, they used rape as a tool of war. Columbus, Custer, many of these other figures, and we know that these systems of oppression are intersecting. It's not just about racism, it's about patriarchy, it's about colonialism, it's about all these things together. And so I really thank the question for raising that important point. I think also there's a troubling history of often the men who are seen to be fighting against these things. It's only been men, right? Like we remember chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and even up through the 1960s, the folks who were seen as leaders of the quote-unquote Red Power movement were so often men, when in fact it was women who were doing a lot of the work. So I think we have a lot of work to do in our own communities to ensure that we uproot all of these systems of oppression.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, only thing I would add is absolutely, I'm glad that the point is raised. I mean, black liberation doesn't happen without black women because systemic racism is built upon the oppression of black women. And not only do we have to combat the historical erasure of the role that black women have played in liberation, we deal with historical erasure happening in real time. I have spent the good part of the past 3 years just telling the story of what happened here because in the immediate aftermath, there was a clear attempt to try to erase the flag action from the narrative of how the flag came down in Columbia, South Carolina, and to repaint it in a way that was less critical of the power structure, right? So that's something that we deal with in real time as well, and oftentimes it does fall on black women to stand up and not allow ourselves to be discounted.
Okay, and did you have anything to add, Andrew? Yes. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry, one more?
Hi, my question is really directed at you, Julian. First of all, I really appreciate that you started your speech speaking in your native language. I'm a first-generation American. I also attended a predominantly white institution. I'm sure that while you were at Columbia and Oxford, you had friends that maybe not just white, but just were not familiar with your background and your culture because it is particularly marginalized. And I wanted to know if you could speak to, how do you encounter situations when you have friends, where just the very nature of your last name raises questions, the very nature of you speaking your language brings about surprise. There is a difference between you speaking your language and hearing someone speak in German, for example, or me speaking in my native language on the bus. I get a different response from someone speaking French.
Yeah, that's such a complicated question, and I don't like to talk too personally about myself, so that's a tough one. But I would say that one thing that we didn't bring into this conversation is the mascot thing, which is kind of the elephant in the room if you're in Washington, D.C. and Native. And there's compelling research that suggests that those mascots and racist imagery of Native people is internalized by Native children. So there's, and I'm also called to the question about white Jesus, right? My grandmother tells me stories about how she was, for so many years, ashamed to be a Native person. And if I'm honest, there are many instances where I come into a space and I kind of don't want to talk about the fact that I'm wearing long hair and that my name is NoiseCat, and if anyone reads that, they're like, oh, well, there's, John Redcorn's walked into the room, And so it's a really tough negotiation of how you bring yourself and that identity and that history that comes along with it into the room. But I think as I've gotten older, I think there's also a pride there. There's and increasingly, a sense of strength in being Native, that represents something that has power, that represents an alternative to the injustices that we see around each other. If we look to places like Standing Rock and to many other places around this continent, there is something now restorative and just about being proud of who you are as a Native person. And so I think that's the self that I aspire to.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for a robust discussion on the politics of memory. I hope you stay around for our next panel, and please join me in thanking again our panelists.